Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Radoslaw Kaczmarek. I'm from Poland. I'm an academic researcher, hence the doctor, but here I'll be speaking purely from a perspective of a patient with severe hemophilia A. And it will be actually a more mixed perspective than just from a developing country, since I don't believe Poland can be any longer chalked up to the list of developing countries. We have 6 units per capita for 4 years. I've been on prophylaxis now. But having said that, I was born in 1986 in Poland, and basically until 2007, we had limited access to clotting factor concentrates, and even on-demand treatment was limited for much of that time, let alone prophylaxis. So throughout the 90s, I did suffer from recurring bleeds, mostly in both knees, ankles, and the left elbow, and it was, as you can imagine, just enough time, especially in those early years when I could only receive treatment in the hospital, so that was just enough time to develop arthropathy and all those affected joints. So this basically left me with limited range of motion in those joints, muscle and strength loss. And new bleeds were very easily triggered at the time, and they were quite easy to distinguish at the time, since especially in those early years, often the therapy was delayed. I am still to this day a born optimist, so it often happened that I chose to believe that it's not a bleed, but perhaps some kind of symptoms that perhaps will go away and it's just temporary, and it often turned out to be something more serious. I would end up with a ballooned up knee at the hospital, and the treatment was much delayed. At the time, of course, before the home treatment was introduced. Then, in the course of time, the access to treatment was improving, and already when we had reasonably good access to on-demand treatment and home treatment, when I was 13, I got interested in resistance training, since mostly my knees were giving me issues. As I mentioned, had limited range of motion. To me, the greatest problem was the weakness. I was hardly able to walk distances longer than 400-500 meters. And obviously other signs of arthropathy like crepitus in motion. The limited range of motion in itself was a problem. I felt that I had poor neuromuscular control over the muscles surrounding the joints. For example, I couldn't sit without the support of my hands and get up. So small things that really were problematic in a daily life, just to give you a picture. So I got interested in resistance training at the age of 13. At that time, only swimming would be any activity that would be recommended by my doctors at the time, if anything, even that cautiously. And I've always loved swimming for the fun of doing it, but I think contrary to many people's experiences, I never felt that well in terms of how the joints felt after a session of swimming. To me, the relaxation that many people credit coming from any kind of training session in water, to me, I always felt it gave me a sense of instability and even less strength afterwards. So to me, it made more sense at the time that perhaps I should challenge those muscles more to try stimulate any meaningful improvement. And I had quite a nerdy approach. I actually credit this as something that probably led me to become a researcher today. I got down to the basics. I wanted to know everything on the molecular level and about the physiology around the exercises. And basically, the years 1999 to 2002 was the time of my experimenting with exercises, nutrition, and basically testing different hypotheses that I came up with, since I didn't really have anybody that I could refer to with this. And on the one hand, I was discouraged by the care team from doing anything required too much effort. On the other hand, I was reading expert materials that, for example, squats are the best exercise to build muscle strength and mass. And obviously I couldn't do even quarter of a squat at the time, but I had this long-term idea that perhaps if I take the right route, starting with lightweight, simple exercises, perhaps I can work my way to the point where I would be able to include those heavy compound exercises and start and really get a meaningful improvement. And I really started light. I started with, since as I've mentioned, I felt that I had little control over the movement and heavy compound isotonic exercises like squats, for example. I started with simple exercises, for example, where quadriceps would be in isometric tension all the time, and even simple exercises like straight leg raises, really with gradual progression of weight, really made me feel the difference and basically feel that I can flex that muscle in a controlled way. And basically that time was basically building a foundation for doing more demanding exercises, also leg raises, standing. I also, to me, it quickly became obvious that it's not only about exercising the target muscle around the target joint, but I noticed that, for example, it gives me a great benefit in terms of my posture and balance if I train the glutes and if I train hamstrings, for example. It very well complemented the role of back and keeping the posture, and that was an issue with the limited extension that I had in my knees. And the real turning point was the year 2002 to 2003, when I was able to include those heavier compound exercises such as squats. Obviously, I started out very lightly. I always had something to tumble on instead of the floor in case something goes wrong, and it all required a lot of preparation to do the actual training session. I started off with short range of motion. And as I've mentioned, I had a very nerdy approach to this. I concocted detailed programs. I had notes. I still have dozens of textbooks from the time with my aim, sets, reps, loads, observations, muscle measurements periodically to see if I'm doing any progress. And it really brought, that time when I was able to do some compound exercises, really brought great results, both in terms of, well, the progress I made. After the first 2 months, I increased the circumference of my thighs by over 5 centimeters, I remember. And most importantly to me, I didn't feel any deterioration in my joints. That was the thing I was fearing before starting doing this, because, I mean, squats, especially exercises like squats, have this bad rep to this day, and especially back in the days, that even for a healthy person, squat maybe is not a good idea. So that I had misgivings about doing this, but I only felt benefits at the time, and so it sort of convinced me to continue this way. And I'm still doing to this day. Today it's much easier. As I mentioned, I've been on prophylaxis since 2013, so it's it's 5 years actually now. And some key observations from the time that I was doing this, and in a minute I'll tell something else in terms of how this affects the way I feel joint and the way I tell a bleed from a flare-up of arthropathy. Well, certainly warm-up. I'm staying in the obvious here, but to me, especially at the time with limited access to treatment, that was key. I would really pay a great deal of attention to warming up enough to be able to do more demanding exercises. So to me, it always worked well to do a cycling session on a stationary bike. Then even to start off with those easy exercises that I started doing anything in the beginning before doing anything more demanding, and warm-up sets of the actual exercise. I do believe that exercising all muscle groups is really the answer also. Correct technique of doing the exercise. control over movement on the concentric and eccentric phase, so when you lift and also when you go back in your movement. Breathing, use as wide range of motion as possible, but don't push it if too painful. Basically, doing adjustments is, I think, one of the most important aspects. Basically, most of the joints that I had issues with, the key was to find the range of motion that I could work with without forcing it through the crepitus, for example, and gradually it would often become less and less of a problem, and I was able to increase the range of motion. As long as I was able to use that range of motion that I had to challenge the muscle. And challenge yourself, of course. Challenge yourself in terms of the intensity of the exercises. Aspire with the long-term goal of doing functional exercises that load muscles in the way and configurations they normally work in. Because, for example, the leg extensions is not really the way quadriceps works in real life, especially with high weight, and neither is the hamstring exercise. Always hamstrings, and most of the time quadriceps too, are assisted by glutes. So certainly this is a much more natural motion. What difference does it all make in the way I tell bleeds from arthropathy flares? I think there's no simple answer to this, but in my case, basically joints are less likely to bleed in the first place when you have stronger muscle, when you feel better stability of the affected joints. Again, I'm stating the obvious, but what also means that joints are less stiff and less likely to go more stiff for no reason, which often happens in long stretches of inactivity. So basically, to me, every training session was like scratching the rust of the joints, and I think the best picture to imagine this is sometimes when I go to the gym, even today, and I have a bad day in terms of how my ankles feel. I feel a lot of cracking there, and I do have a limited range of motion. But if I train calves, for example, during that session, after I leave the gym, the shoes that really I thought were not my best pair of shoes all of a sudden become the best shoes in the world. It's like everything. It sort of goes to show that we really become settled in the limitations that arise as a result of bleeds, and getting that rust off may be helpful. So when you are able to shift that balance from this feeling stiff and never able to take off immediately to more of that rust off state, you are more likely to tell that something is really wrong where a bleed happens rather than another flare-up of arthropathy. So this would be a little bit of my mixed experience.